So the first issue we want to talk about in the Senate deal is expanding the definition of what qualifies as an FFL dealer, a federal firearms license dealer. So typically when any American wants to go buy a weapon, what they do is they go to a gun store or a gun show, and if you are an FFL dealer, which every gun store is, and the vast majority of people that attend and sell weapons at gun shows are as well, then that purchase has to go through a NICS background check. The current impetus for people to voluntarily comply with that is they want to be able to keep their license. So if you're expanding the definition of who an FFL dealer is, you're going to necessarily start capturing people who are not actually dealers. These could be people trying to sell a shotgun to a family member, or who have inherited a collection from a grandpa of 10, 20 weapons, perhaps 200 weapons, and perhaps those private citizens don't want them. They want to get rid of them. They want to sell them off. These are people who are not typically dealers, and depending on the fine print of the text that we see in legislative form, this could comprise quite a few Americans or very few Americans. But the end goal here from the left is to expand this to apply to as many people as possible. It's a backdoor way to try to attain a universal background check system, which is of course unworkable if you don't have a gun registry by which to hold people accountable and actually enforce the law from a governmental standpoint. If a dad gives his son a shotgun, there's no way for the government to know about that unless the government has a registry and a system by which to ensure that every transaction has to go through a background check, so that if they detect in whatever way that gun is in the hands of someone that it doesn't belong to, the only way they would know that is if they have a system in place to bounce it off and verify it, which means that at the end game of all of this, and why conservatives should not cede ground on this, is that this is really trying to slow walk us into the direction of establishing universal background checks that will only work if you have a gun registry. Another issue that we want to keep an eye on in the final text of the bill is any additional pre-sale requirements. It'll be interesting to see what additional regulatory burdens and requirements are put on people who are classified as dealers that will just make it harder for citizens to actually gain access and purchase weapons to fulfill their right to keep and bear arms. Another part of the bill that we're keeping an eye on is an enhanced background check feature that would apply to 18 through 20-year-olds. Although again, we don't have the specifics of the text, one thing that we're keeping an eye on is how is this worded, how long of a time delay will it incur, what are the parameters of this additional background check, and how much of a chilling effect will it have on people who should otherwise be considered adults and largely who will be law-abiding citizens. How are they going to have their right infringed upon to be able to attain a weapon in a manner that other adults can already do otherwise. Another feature of the Senate deal is the so-called boyfriend loophole. So right now in many of the states there are misdemeanor domestic abuse charges that can be levied against people. If this loophole is removed and misdemeanors are now used as a pretext for gun confiscation, should a boyfriend and girlfriend break up and they have a shouting match at each other and the boyfriend's charged with a misdemeanor domestic abuse because he raised his voice at an inappropriate time in the evening, or however the states in very many different ways define these statutes, which we don't have control over. If this is removed, then you're basically elevating or lowering the bar, I should say, at which rights can be curtailed. So now you have misdemeanor offenses as the ground floor at which government can intercede and deprive you of your rights. Traditionally, we consider felony actions the line in the sand at which government can deprive you of rights. And that's really the answer here is, states, this is a bad provision, but states should move towards felonies and move away from these misdemeanor convictions if the federal government's going to start incentivizing using misdemeanors as a pretext to deny people their Second Amendment rights. And then last but not least, and perhaps the most problematic portion of the Senate framework, is money that will be used to fund red flag laws. And so there are arguments in the Senate that they will ensure that red flag laws will have due process considerations. But what is red flag law? This is basically if someone has a concern about someone, their actions, their rhetoric, that they will notify the relevant authorities, and those authorities will, without due process, remove the weapons from that person, hold on to them, and then and this all takes place before an actual trial and an actual verdict. And this is problematic in that the left is trying to weaponize what violence is and to redefine what violence is. For instance, if you misgender someone, the left will say that that's a violent action. The FBI and the DOJ have conspired to investigate parents who are concerned about critical race theory in their schools. If I state that the purpose of the Second Amendment is for people to be able to take up arms against their own government should it become a domestic tyranny, is that a violent threat? So these are all considerations that we have to be concerned about, and it's important to remember that there is no such thing as a red flag law that provides due process. If it provides adequate due process, it's no longer a red flag law, it's just a normal prosecution and conviction process within our legal system. So there's no situation in which red flag laws should be considered appropriate. They're manifestly unconstitutional, and we need to be sure that we avoid them at all costs. To round out what we're concerned about within this framework is that it's going to punish good citizens. It's going to weaponize government in ways that we can't predict and on slippery slopes, especially in radical leftist states that we can't predict and won't know, but we know it's going in a bad direction generally. And it's going to further balkanize communities that are already separating based on partisan lines. People are going to increasingly be up in arms against their neighbors, metaphorically, not literally. They're going to be disputing politics within their own neighborhoods. They're going to be moving to different states based on political standing. And we're going to have a nation that continues to divide into two different nations instead of one nation of people with a common tradition and common history and a common set of principles and values. So that's the Senate deal. Those are all of our concerns about what's happening with the Senate deal and what we need to keep an eye on. Again, we need to keep a good eye on the actual text of the legislation, pour through that and figure out what else is wrong with any bill that might come forward, or what might be acceptable, although I don't anticipate that any of this is going to ultimately be acceptable given the people that are writing the bill and the people who have signed on to support it.